Hi, I'm Cheryl Trepka. I'm here with my friend Jackson, that's the dog, and my other friend Chad, who's doing the recording. I have been an adjunct for colloquium classes for about 10 years now, and we are doing this to virtually share the downtown field trip experience. We're starting at the Collaboratory. The Collaboratory is a project by the Southwest Florida Community Foundation. I encourage you, if you want to know any more about downtown redevelopment, what stage it's in, what night they have music night, what night they have art fest, go to Southwest Florida Community Foundation. Also, if you want to learn the history, so much history to downtown Fort Myers. I know I never knew very much about it until I took colloquium myself, and then learned even more when I started teaching it. As you can see, the building that we're standing in front of, this was an open air train depot. It came in 1924. This is now the Collaboratory. The Collaboratory is a shared workspace environment. Different groups, different businesses can come here. They have large meeting rooms. You can rent the meeting rooms. You can use them for education purposes. It is quite a up-and-coming business model. I think it's one of the fastest growing business models actually in the U.S. right now is shared workspace. But this building is a good place to start a class on sustainability because it incorporates people and profits and planet. Perfect place to start our field trip. So today I'm going to be sharing what I learned about downtown Fort Myers from a couple different places. I took a true tour a couple different times. If you are looking for something different to do, their haunted tour is a lot of fun. The colloquium staff, of course, taught me everything about downtown. And docent Jim. We're at the Collaboratory. This has quite the history. Most recently, it was the Southwest Florida Museum, and my classes and I would come here, and docent Jim taught me so much about downtown, made quite the impression on me. It began as an open-air train depot in 1924, and you can see they left the railroad tracks. Now this is a LEED certified building, a gold building. It is in place and was developed as a community working space. So it is a perfect place to appreciate sustainability. It is based on the three principles, people, planet, profit. People work here, they use the internet, community groups meet here, they use their meeting rooms. Profit. This is a shared workspace. It is one of the newer and more profitable business models that is out nowadays, and it was built with the planet in mind. To become a gold certified LEED building, it used local materials. It reused the old train depot. It is bike friendly. There's places to park bikes, repair bikes. There is a shower inside, which I'm here on a Sunday morning. We can't go in, but there is a shower inside meant for people to be able to bike here and then clean up. There is also a wall of plants inside. So it is built with sustainability in mind. This is the Three Friends statue. These were the vagabonds, they called themselves, in around the 1910 to 1920. They took trips into the Everglades, and they actually dressed like this. Now Edison is reclining. He is the one that makes so much sense. He brought batteries and lights into the Everglades on these expeditions. Ford, of course, was the one that brought transportation. And the other one is Firestone, and he was the one that brought the provisions, the food. This was in a complete state of disrepair. The fountains are now right now, but they often are, and it has been completely renovated very recently, last couple years. So you may have wondered if there really ever was a fort in Fort Myers. There was. During the early 1800s, the focus was on removing the Seminoles, the indigenous people down here. We had the Seminole Wars 1, 2, and 3. That was a priority for the federal government. The fort was built in around the 1850s, used to remove the last of the Seminoles. They were hunted. The fort was abandoned until the 1860s. Then in the Civil War, the fort became useful again. We were on the Union side, and the troops that were in the fort supported the efforts to get cattle and food to the Union Army. This statue represents the 2nd Regimental Infantry, which was a group from our area, and it was a colored troop, a colored regiment. And I always enjoy reading the poem when I'm down here with my students. Yeah, Jack, the dog that we have with us, is not a fan of statues. He's totally weirded out by it. Jack, I'm going to go ahead and read the poem, okay? In freedom, cover me. The war between the states, it's called to make us all one people. One man's bullet is another man's death. In this, God makes us equal. The men who died in the fight today all knew this was the start of some new age yet undefined, of which we're all a part. This Union flag I stand beneath is what's protecting me from a life of moral death and a life in slavery. When muskets fire, if I should fall in freedom, cover me with these stars from this flag, like leaves from God's great tree. Clayton. So we did have a lot of meaningful wars, unfortunately, that were fought from our fort here, that of course no longer stands. So this area was a yacht basin over on the far side where all the yachts are. This was part of a WPA program. That is the program that came about after the Great Depression. Roosevelt put in place. It was meant to put people back to work. Now the basin here is used to filter the water that runs off from downtown. It's the Department of Environmental Protection that sets limits on the harmful substances that are put into the water. The Colusa is listed as impaired because it has high nitrogen levels. So part of the renovation, redevelopment of downtown came with it a $5 million plan to treat stormwater. It's got to be treated before it gets into the Colusa, because we don't want to be putting nasty water from the Colusa into the Gulf. This basin has bubblers on the bottom as fountains during the night. They turn the lights on, the fountains are on. It's really pretty. But the bubblers are what actually oxygenate the water and help to make it healthy before it ends up into the river and then into the Gulf. It also filters the water as well. Now, mangroves would do this naturally, but the mangroves were all removed for development. You'll see a lot of mangroves if you walk closer to Centennial Park, but if you look at the braces that are here along this railing, these are kind of paying homage to the mangroves. That's the reason they were built with that design in place. So this is the brand new hotel that we've been waiting on for maybe 20 years. The city, in part of its redevelopment, wanted to put a convention center, which they have harborside. They were supposed to have a hotel accompany it because you really don't need to have a convention center unless you have a place for people to stay who come to have conventions. But there was a property. They were going to turn it into a hotel. It was owned by a Japanese family, and the man who owned it passed away, and he didn't leave real good instructions of what to do with that property. So I think that was in the courts for maybe 12 to 20 years. Now it is on the other end of downtown, and it is a 50 and over hotel community. There's, I think, some rehabilitation done in there, but this finally is the hotel that will support the convention center harborside.
Go.
This downtown area was a working waterfront from the 1800s to the 1930s. This is the top of what used to be the Pleasure Palace. It was built in 1927. It was put on the end of a pier. It was 2-story. It was dismantled in 1943. People saved the top story because they felt the pier was going to wash into the river. So they dismantled the building, but they saved this top part. It was always used for pleasure, hence the name, Pleasure Palace. Edison had birthday parties there. The USO used it for troops, this building here, that were stationed at Page and Buckingham Fields. It used to be across the street on the water. It was the Hall of 50 States. Community groups used it for performances, and I think most recently it was used as an art exhibit for Olympic athlete artists. So it is still nice inside. The cost to refurbish it would be exorbitant. It is on a piece of property that is very valuable. I mean, you can just, if you're down here standing on the sidewalk, you see Firestone over there with its rooftop. We've got the new hotel, and you've got an entire, except for a parking lot, pretty much vacant city block right across the street from the river. So super valuable. The question is, if it's sold, should the person who buys it be responsible for revamping the Pleasure Palace as part of our history? Or should they be allowed to renovate less expensively and just tear the thing down? You decide. Alright, so this is the Palm Garden. It was created in 1955. I've always found when I come here with students that most of them have no idea this exists. It honors the name of our city. We are the city of palms. And one thing that I learned is that Edison was the one who kind of started all this, bringing all these exotic palms and plants from around the world. He did this because he was always looking for better filament for his light bulb. So this was his quest. And we have this beautiful Palms Park. It has palms from many, many, many different parts of the world. Share with students when we're walking down here on the corner of First Street and Lee Street. There is this Goodwill. What could be more sustainable than a Goodwill? This one's a little bit different. It's a high-end Goodwill. So all of the Goodwill stores, when they take in donations, anything that is kind of a designer brand, they will send here. So a good place to come, get some wardrobe for a workplace perhaps. And across the street, again, we're at Lee and First. This is a pretty important building as far as our history that is under renovation. This is the old Federal Post Office. It was built in 1933. It stopped being used in the 60s. It was built of Key West limestone and coquina, which are building materials that you are not allowed to use anymore. When it closed down in the 60s, no one wanted to buy it. The feds tried to sell it to the state tried to sell it to the county. Ended up, the city bought it for $186,000, and they lease it to the Art Association for $1 a year. And that's the reason nobody wanted to buy it, because it was in such a state of disrepair. It is still being renovated, but it is now the Fort Myers Art Institute. Byrne Davis, this is named for Sidney and Byrne Davis. She just passed about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. She lived to be 102, and she donated $1 million to restore it. Now, the towers that are in front of it are really unique. If you come down to downtown at night and you see these lit up, and you can see a little bit of the pattern in the shadow this morning. But one of the towers has all the scientific names of all the plants that Edison grew, and the other one has the story of the Seminoles finding the Colusa River. The Seminoles came down to the Everglades and lived in the area from the 1850s, 1860s. They too were trying to escape the Civil War. Interesting that, like all indigenous peoples, they were so in touch with nature. During the hurricane of 1928, 1,836 people died up by Lake O. None of them were Seminoles. Seminoles lived there. Seminoles moved before the hurricane. They moved 3 days before. And yes, they shared that information with the settlers. The settlers chose not to believe them. But the story in Seminole culture says that there was a child who came to the Seminoles and said, "Big wind coming." And that was all this kid would say for like a day. They believed it and they left. 1,836 settlers died, not one Seminole died. They, being in touch with nature, they left the area. This is a 3-women mural. It's a fairly new addition to downtown. It was painted by Mr. Bravo, who actually is an artist as a hobby. I think he's an insurance person, actually. It represents the founders of Fort Myers. We were, and we still are today, a very diverse county. This represents the cultures who founded our community. Most of the people, if they didn't come down from up north and settle, they were from the islands. So you have Hispanic and African American women there. When Fort Myers was just a town, interracial couples were the norm and diversity was widely accepted. Now in the background in the painting, that's the Pleasure Palace. That's what was here in the 1920s that everybody went to after they dropped off their cattle, after they sold their citrus. This is where they would go and have some fun. We are at the downtown Fort Myers Library. I always like to share this with students because a lot of times people don't know that it's here. It's beautiful, it has gorgeous grounds, it's got some shade. The library used to have, pre-COVID, life-size chess pieces that people could move around. They always had unique rocking chairs sitting out front, and I'm sure that will all come back after COVID. You can see there are some musical instruments. A great place to come and bring some kids. If you've got nieces or nephews or kids of your own and you've never been to the downtown library, it's a lot of open space for them to run after they go in and check out a book. This fountain is on the library property, and I always ask students if they can't guess what it was. It has a plaque on it, but it is branding irons. So this is an homage to the settlers who came and made their living from the cattle that they would bring down here to sell. Arcade Theater was an open-air arcade. It was built in 1915. It fell into a disrepair. Most of the area was really thriving, really hopping. I mean, Babe Ruth came down for spring training. He actually, the story is, got so drunk the night before, it was the only time he couldn't play his game the next day in his history. But in the 1929, with the Great Depression, everything kind of started to go downhill in downtown area, like so many around the country, when the Edison Mall was built in 1960. That's when it really took a dive. Nobody was coming downtown. Mikhail Baryshnikov, I know he's a little bit old for most college students, but he's a famous ballet artist, and he's exceptionally interesting, I think, because he actually was Russian. He defected to our country. Well, he came to Fort Myers, and somebody brought him to the Arcade Theater, and it was, and still is, just gorgeous. It had the velvet seats, it has the ceiling that looks like stars, and it was in such a state of disrepair, he started a large fundraising campaign to renovate it, and that has worked really well. Now, as you can see, one of the big parts of this redevelopment, one of the first steps was the community development people went to the building owners and said, you know what, if you would put housing on the second and third floor and your offices on the second and third floor, so that the first floor was for walking traffic, that would be great. And that started it off. That was a big help in redeveloping downtown. So this used to be open air. Thankfully now it's air conditioned. This is the entranceway to the Arcade Theater. They have doctor's offices, the Naples Soap Company, little boutique type stores. But the Florida Repertory Theater is renowned. If you don't know anything about it, you want something different, something fun to do. The tickets for students are exceptionally reasonable. Before COVID, they used to be $10 or $12, so I just hate to say that without knowing for sure. But they really encourage and try to get young people down here. Very well known theater. Architecture is not my interest. So I came down here and took a tour with True Tours of Fort Myers, and they talked all about the architecture, the people who built all of these buildings, and the Five and Dime, the very long building over here with all the little green circles on the top. Hold on, I'm waiting for the firemen. That was the Five and Dime. So that was your old Walmart, single-story Walmart building. The one that is the First National Bank, I remember them from True Tours talking about the bank, and then they said at the other end of the block there was another guy who built, and he had 6 marble steps where this guy put 5 marble steps on First National Bank. And excuse my language, but that's the only thing I got out of that architecture part of this. It's just it was kind of a pissing contest between the people who built Fort Myers. So not my interest. Sorry about that. I don't know very much about it. But if you are into architecture, you definitely can learn a lot if you come down and check out these buildings that were put up in the 1910s, 1920s. architecture that was used when Fort Myers was being built. There was a gentleman who was fond of Moroccan type architecture. That's what this building represents. This is Patio de Leon. It was built so that tourists would come from 3 or 4 different little walking alleys to come back into this patio, and there were little shops around here. One of the first ones was a chocolate shop, but you have to question, why would you have a chocolate shop in Fort Myers in South Florida? But one of them was chocolate. There was a problem with it melting, so they wanted to really pull the tourists back here. They could. For that reason, they built a fountain, and they actually had live alligators in it. That works from time to time. The ball on top spins when the water comes through it, and it is not working now, but that's where it stems from. They did have little baby alligators and signs all around the streets to bring your kids back and let them play with the alligator. That was the big draw. Now we have Downtown House of Pizza, Cabo's Cantina, a place where you can view old-time movies. And if you go up towards the courthouse a little bit, there's a window that you can get some great tacos from. Officer Widman passed away on the spot. He was answering a domestic disturbance call, and he was only in the police service for 1 year. He left a wife and 3 children. The Fort Myers Police Department just recently redid this memorial, and I encourage you to come and view it on Main Street. It's at one of the entrances that goes into Patio de Leon. We are looking at the courthouse. The original courthouse was built in the 1910s. It had no courtrooms and no bathrooms. So citizens went to the county seat, which at that time was Monroe County, which is down in the Keys, and they wanted to get money to build the courthouse correctly. They were turned down. So the citizens did what was common in the time. If ever you were taking down a building, you dismantled it and then you used it like it was a Home Depot. They dismantled this courthouse 2, 3, 4 in the morning. It was gone by daybreak, and the county seat then had no choice but to give them the money to put up a new courthouse. This courthouse we call the old courthouse. There is a newer one on Monroe Street, just a little bit to the east of it. The banyan trees were beautiful and still are on Fort Estates, and there is one on this property as well. The tree in the front of the courthouse, they spent $70,000 trying to save it when a hurricane pretty much demolished it. So an artist came in and was commissioned and carved that into the beautiful eagle statue that it is. But trying to preserve the history of our area. stories tall. There is a pool and a bar on the top. So even if you just go to the 8th floor and have a beverage while you're looking out over Fort Myers, you can see the harbor, the basin. You can look at the fountain. The lights at night are very pretty, and the architecture in here is beautiful. Barbara Jo Revelle was given the commission to create this mural. When federal buildings were built in the 60s, President Kennedy passed legislation that new builds had to use half of 1% of their budget for art. She accepted a commission to create a history of Fort Myers, and she chose to create what is called an alternative history. Although brochures were created and printed to give out during the dedication ceremony, there was never a dedication ceremony. The group who commissioned the work, nobody really writes about it or talks about it, but the assumption is they were not happy with her work. She dedicated the mural to the 180,000 African American troops who fought for the Union and to the Seminoles, the present-day survivors of the Seminole Wars. The Seminoles are the only tribe to have never signed a treaty with the United States government. The stockade is pictured there with the 2nd Regiment troops in front of it. Billy Bowlegs is the Seminole who is prominent in the mural. He used a guerrilla-type warfare against the Seminoles. He was pretty successful for a long time. Ben Bruno, it was not in the mural, it was a freed slave. He and Billy Bowlegs ran the Seminoles, fought for the Seminoles, but when it was time to surrender, he sold each of his people and the cows and the livestock that they had. They were loaded onto a boat at Billy's Creek, which is named after him, Billy Bowlegs. They were taken in the north side of the Gulf, where they joined the Trail of Tears and walked to Oklahoma. He went with them, and most of them died up there. There is a post where men are being whipped. In 1924, there was lynching of African American boys under the age of 16. It was kind of a typical To Kill a Mockingbird story. This happened all the time in the South, where interracial couples, young kids would be fooling around, and they would say that the white girl couldn't be fooling around with the black guy, therefore she must have been raped. The settler is depicted here with cattle. The term cracker is often used, but it did not originate with the crack of the whip in Central Florida, as some people say. Shakespeare actually used that term to describe kind of hardy folk who managed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. This was the settlers who survived the weather and the mosquitoes here, if you can imagine, without air conditioning and bug spray. The only thing that was preventing the area from really prospering back in the 1910s was the lack of a railroad. Now in 1894, Florida had a big freeze. Farmers lost all their crops. They continued to buy land farther and farther south. This was kind of a sick joke. They were doing this to themselves. Every time the farmers would settle, they would drain a piece of land and plant on it. Well, when they drained the land, they lost this blanket of warm, wet air that would keep it warm in the winter. Then they would have a freeze, then they would move further and further south. So this was the pattern that went on for quite some time, but the big freeze of 1894 was the one that really sent many south, and they said, we need a railroad. Unfortunately, the railroad was brought to us in 1924. And here's the thing, if it had just brought transportation, it would have been great. It brought with it segregation. Our area was a diverse and inclusive community of multiple cultures. But the railroad built a white ticket booth and a colored ticket booth. White waiting area, colored waiting areas. Same with water fountains. And as I was doing some research for this, I saw that as late as the 1970s, the trains, even though they still weren't officially legally segregated, they were still loading as if they had segregation still in place. The person I learned the most from about downtown was a docent at the Southwest Florida Museum, which is no longer there. It's now the Collaboratory. But Docent Jim always pointed out to my students and me that you have to be aware of your culture and its values, because something as small as that can turn it in a matter of days. So we're wrapping up where we began, talking about the train depot built in 1924, which managed to segregate our diverse and inclusive community, coming full circle from where we began at the Collaboratory, a sustainably built piece of architecture that's meant to unite and bring community together, ending on a positive note, a note of positive change.